Our next session is on AI and education, featuring speakers Sal Khan and Vilas Dhar. Moderating this session is Professor Jan-Hennessy. John is a pioneering figure in computer science and served as the 10th president of Stanford University from 2000 to 2016. He's also the chairman of Alphabet Inc. and co-recipient of the 2017 Turing Award for his contributions to the development of RISC architecture. John's visionary leadership and groundbreaking research have significantly shaped the landscape of modern computing. Please join me in welcoming Jan-Hennessy to the stage.
Welcome everyone to what I predict will be the best session in the entire conference. So almost 12 years ago, I gave a keynote speech entitled "The Coming Tsunami in Educational Technology," which predicted that MOOCs and online education would completely redo higher education. I was a little premature. But this time, I think the transformation of educational technology and how we do education, driven by breakthroughs in AI and LLMs in particular, is pretty certain. So this afternoon, we are joined by two individuals with deep experience in the space. Sal Khan, the founder and CEO of Khan Academy, needs no introduction, I think. He continues to do innovative things in exploring the use of the technology. Khan Academy now has more than 150 million registered users in 190 countries and is available in more than 50 languages. Vilas Dhar is the president and trustee of the Patrick McGovern Foundation, where he works on the intersection of technology, society, and philanthropy, leading initiatives that leverage technology for social good, emphasizing ethical and inclusive AI technology. Please join me in welcoming Sal and Vilas. So Sal, let's start with you. AI has raised a lot of hopes about what it might do to improve education. Certainly one of the biggest gaps we have in our country, and that's increased with the explosion of LLMs. What do you think about what's your best hope and what's your best fear with respect to this revolution?
And my answer changes a little bit because things are moving so fast all the time. But I always like to take the technology out of the picture and just think about, like, what are our goals as a society? And we've known for thousands of years what a world-class education looks like. I always point out Alexander the Great had Aristotle as his personal tutor, and Aristotle had Plato as a mentor, and I'm not sure it was a personal tutor, but it was one of his was his mentor. And if you were a member of nobility or a young princeling for the last 2,000 years, you probably had a really good education. But most people got no education. And for most of human history, most people were illiterate. Subject matters like algebra was considered esoteric. You fast forward about 300 years ago, mass public education. Lots of great things happened, but we had to make some compromises. It's the Industrial Revolution. How do we teach 30 kids at once, cost effectively? Well, we'll batch them together. We'll have some centrally administered standards, move them at a set pace. Some kids will get it, some kids won't. Some gaps will accumulate. The kids who keep doing well, yeah, but they're bound for what we now would call the knowledge economy, being entrepreneurs, being doctors, lawyers, engineers, researchers, and everyone else, we'll slot them someplace else in the labor pyramid. And that's what we've been doing for the last 200-300 years. What we've been talking about, and when I say we, the collective we, when we talk about the potential for education technology is, well, maybe we don't have to make that trade-off anymore, and this is even pre-AI. Hey, even with things like on-demand video, the internet, and software, maybe you can start to approximate some of that personalization. A lot of folks know that I got started on the Khan Academy journey by tutoring cousins, and it was working for them. And a lot of what we've been doing over the last almost 20 years since I started tutoring my cousin Nadia was we're trying to approximate that personalization I was doing for her. So the opportunity with AI is to be able to go that much further. In our team, I think a lot of the Khan Academy team is like all in, we have to do really well and use AI. And some people are like, well, why are we so all in on AI? And I'm like, it's not for AI's sake. It's that there's this ideal, and using traditional technologies, we could approach it, and we were having efficacy. but we're not going to get here. But now with generative AI, it feels like the opportunity to get much closer. And then there's the opportunity that Khan Academy wasn't historically addressing, but we are now, which is being able to serve teachers better. Traditionally, education technology would go to a teacher and say, look at our efficacy studies. If you just learn this extra thing, we're going to accelerate your outcomes by X, Y, or Z. And teachers believe it and they want to implement it. They want to implement the personalization, but they're already stretched thin. It's one more thing for them to do. When they go into the classroom, it usually doesn't happen. But now it's also the potential to be a teaching assistant, help with lesson planning, help with grading, help with progress report writing, being able to really riff with the teacher instead of giving them these kind of boring ed tech dashboards, which we've all traditionally done. You can talk to them. So that's the opportunity, a tutor for every student, a teaching assistant for every teacher, and we can extrapolate on, in some ways it can do much more than that. It can take kids on an immerse and go into the vascular system or travel the stars if you throw VR into it. The worst fears, and unfortunately a lot of these are already happening. I mean, there's broader fears in the world of misinformation and deep fakes and fraud, and unfortunately a lot of that's already crept into the school system. We talk about social media, but now social media is that much worse because people can put deep fakes out. There's already been cases of people using some of these large language models to create videos of classmates doing horrible things. A lot of us know about that case of a disgruntled district employee who created a deep fake of their superintendent saying racist things. The superintendent almost lost their job. So you have all of those really bad risks. I think there's the broader risk of fears of cheating, fears of cutting shortcuts, but I think that's where we've been putting a lot of work in, putting extra guardrails that not only you can't use our tools for cheating, but I think can undermine other forms of cheating.
Yeah. So Vilas, you in your foundation, you've been working on try to close the equity gap and make sure opportunities are more broadly available to all Americans. How do you think about this around these new AI tools, and are they going to improve, or are they going to make the gap wider over time?
Thanks, John. I'm going to be very rude and tell you I think it's the wrong question. I think no matter what, we don't ask the tools to improve or make things worse. They just don't, right? At the end of the day, and I know I'm sitting at the heart and center of technological innovation, the story of AI is fundamentally going to be about people, institutions, and our society, and the decisions we make about how we apply these tools. Let me tell you a story. I was talking to my nephew just a few days ago, and I think you'll like this story, Sal. I was asking him, he's a really good kid, right? He loves robotics, he loves soccer, he loves all the things that 13-year-old kids are supposed to. And I was talking to him about what he's doing in school, and he said, you know what, I'm in this robotics class, and it's amazing. I said, cool, tell me all about it. He said, well, I was asked to train a robot how to do a whole set of tasks. I said, great, how did you figure it out? He said, well, I didn't really know. And I said, did you go talk to your teacher? He said, no, my teacher's too busy, too many students in the classroom. I said, so what did you do? And he said, well, I went online, and I went on one of these AI tools, and I started asking it, how do I train? And it was the most commonplace exchange that I think any of us today might just say, yeah, of course he did. Think about 5 years ago, how absurd it would have been to say that my 13-year-old nephew is going to an AI to learn skills about how to train an AI to do AI things. What a crazy world. Well, that's one story, right? And Sal, I think you get this well, right? This is why people are coming to Khan Academy, because it's an amazing resource. But let's think about the second order effect of that. You've got kids in classrooms who are saying, the teacher's no longer the place I go as my first stop in learning. They're not even really saying, I'm going to the other kids in the class. They're saying, I'm going to go online. And you extrapolate that out and you say, in resource-constrained settings, particularly in those schools that aren't in our top-tier cities with the large tax bases, you've got all these kids that are using this as a learning mechanism. On one side, there's a great empowering story there, right? What a great thing we can do to move the pressure off of resource-constrained systems. But on the other side, what happened to the fact that kids learned how to socialize with each other in the classroom? That a teacher plays a more significant role than just conveying information. They shape a whole set of what it means to be a creative individual. They reinforce behaviors like curiosity. They tamp down behaviors that maybe lead to bad social effects. Where are we going to deliver social and educational learning if we decide that AI is the solution? I share that with you, John, because it's a microcosm of the answer. We look at education as one part of a much broader story. Whether it's economic opportunity or gender rights or disability access, AI is going to have a role to play. But we're never going to be able to assign responsibility for the outcome to the tools. And if we start from there, then we are fundamentally making a problem that's going to have repercussions across our society.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because when I asked when the MOOCs were not catching on the way we expected them to, particularly around remedial education, which I thought was the low-hanging fruit that we desperately needed help with. I asked my colleagues in the ed school why, and they mentioned one thing you mentioned, Saul, adaptation and the ability to customize. But the other thing they mentioned was the personal inspiration of a teacher, another human being inspiring good behavior. And so how can we get this somehow? I mean, maybe an LLM that talks like her, only it's a teacher rather than your girlfriend? I mean...
Well, let me ask you a question, if you don't mind. I'll say, we are now spending billions of dollars on AI development, right? And you look back on the last 50 years of education, and you say, how much did we really spend on ensuring that the teacher in the classroom was set up to make sure those students were successful? How did we invest in training those teachers to be able to do these things beyond subject matter knowledge? Across the use of AI in labor systems, in customer service, in scientific research, what if we made sure that we paralleled the amount of research we're putting into LLM development or tool development or underlying technology with sustaining and supporting the human elements of interaction that make the application of those tools possible? And who does that? Well, right now, the answer, unfortunately, John, is philanthropy, right? Government systems aren't set up to do it. They're not naming it as a priority. And the market forces attached to this are looking for short-term wins. Since we started the foundation, I think we're about to hit at the end of this year, $500 million in capital that we put on the table specifically to do this, to not invest in LLM development, but to invest in an ecosystem of support so that as AI comes into its own, we've got social resilience, we've got inspiration, we've got professionals that know how to think about using these tools in a way that center human dignity and equity.
These are things, had we done some of these things for social media before we let it get rolling and going down, we probably would have gotten the benefits without all the downsides that we currently see. So I think it's a good point. Saul, I know you've been working on these new AI-powered learning tools. There are a bunch of people out here who are developers. What would you tell them from your perspective of using this technology in education? What advice would you give to them? What do they need to worry about? What drawbacks do they need to be cautious about?
Yeah, I'll just reinforce kind of where I left off, where Vilas actually took it, which is don't start with the technology. I mean, the technology is coming out and it's improving daily. It's very exciting. I think all of us as kind of tech nerds are like, wow, it can do that now, it can do that now. Surely there's a problem it can solve. But don't start with that. Start with the problem that you're trying to solve. Holistically, not just, hey, if only someone were to use this tech in this way, it's going to be awesome. It should be, what are the human systems? What are the inertias? Well before AI came on the scene, just to back up what was just said is, I had a somewhat, if you build it, they will come attitude towards Khan Academy. I mean, to some degree, it was true for students and families and a lot of teachers, but we realized that unless you go in there and have a real ground game and think about professional development and think about how you fit into the systems that are already there, you're not going to have the impact that you really want. But yeah, I would say get close to the problem, understand the problems, don't get enamored with the technology. I think that large language models in AI, there's a lot of amazing application for it, but sometimes the solution might be paper, sometimes it might be pencil. And try to do the simplest, most adoptable thing that will do the job.
So, Vilas, when you think about these issues, and the nice thing about a foundation is you think about the long term and the long-term impact and you invest for that. Take us out 10 years. Now this technology is widely available. It's changed the way we educate people. It's changed the way we train them, maybe changed K-12. What do you hope will occur as we look out over that? And what are you worried about in terms of displacement of jobs or certain things that are no longer valued as much as they once were?
Yeah. It's a great question. I mean, 10 years, look, I am a hopeless optimist about all of this, right? And not just about what technology will do, but our ability to use them in amazing ways. So I envision a future where a set of things happen that I care about deeply. One is that we come up with a mechanism to incentivize the use of these tools for things that are about human welfare. At Stanford HAI's slogan that I believe in so deeply, right? An AI-enabled, human-centered future. And so what does it look like to do that? Well, we think about three things. One is we have to invest in capacity, not just to use these tools, but to build them inside of civil society. Organizations that are at the front line of climate change or ensuring rural health access in last-mile villages or in educational systems. We don't rely on a small set of private sector institutions to build that for the rest of us. It's not because they're not good at it. They will do it. They'll do it with deep care. But when it's being done to a community or for a community is a fundamentally different story than being done by a community, which means we need to invest in that kind of capacity building at scale. The second is we need to change the story. I mean, we are so focused on what LLMs will do because they give us some sort of like language emotional connection. But really, where are the most amazing opportunities from a civil society perspective? Teach me how to optimize my supply chain so I can get vaccines and drugs out to rural communities using the R&D that's already been developed in the private sector, and 100 other use cases like that. And the third is restructuring this idea that technology moves at a pace and the rest of society has to come along. Right? We have to flip the game here. We have to get our policymakers, always an easy start, right? But also really all of us to say, not how do we apply the technology that's being developed to our problem, but how do we use the problem we're facing to define the technology we will build? How does that lead to a reallocation of research dollars, of access to compute, of the creation of data sets that aren't merely those that are commercially valuable, but are truly representative of all of the things that are happening in the world that nobody's yet cared to measure? I'll give you one example on this. I was recently talking to somebody in a West African country, and I asked a question. I said, how much information can you give me about natural mineral deposits in the country? And I got the rustling of papers, and I was like, well, what kind of resolution do you need? Do you want it down to a square meter? Do you want it down to half a meter? I said, okay, I get it, right? You know where stuff is. Tell me where the drinkable water is in the country. They were like, we actually don't have a data set that answers that question, right? These are fundamental things we need to change. But if we did, that 10-year vision becomes super rosy very quickly.
Yeah. Yeah. So this, Vilas's point makes me think about something. I mentioned that Khan Academy is available in 50 languages, but the number of languages spoken on our planet is over 300. And lots of them are low-resourced languages in the global south that don't have access to this technology. Do you see that these LLM tools and the various AI breakthroughs could really bring quality education to people that otherwise probably don't have a good source of it?
Yeah, simple answer is yes. Obviously, we were already on that journey before the LLMs came, but we are working on the tooling now, where now it's not live yet, but in the coming months, we have thousands of volunteer translators, localizers in all of these different geographies for these 50+ languages, but we know there's many more.
Right.
But can the large language model take the first pass and have it there, and then have the humans go and correct it and edit it, but at least the first pass was there, and it's 95% good, and it's getting better every day. And that will also allow us to go into some of these smaller languages, or these languages where there aren't as many resources.
Yeah. So I think one of the themes of HAI and of this conference has been human augmentation instead of human replacement. Talk a little more about how you see this. I mean, Saul, you mentioned ways in which you could support a teacher, for example. Being married to somebody who was a teacher, I can tell you, teachers have no time available. They are working all out in their classroom. They're dealing with a wide range of performance. How could we really augment that teacher, not completely replace them, but make them more effective?
Yeah, I was at Menlo Park, not too far away, for a book thing last week, and I just asked the audience, are there any English teachers? And someone raised their hand, and I was like, okay, do you have any papers to grade? They're like, yeah, I have papers. And I was like, how many? 180. 180 papers to grade. I was like, how much do you spend per paper? And she's like, anywhere from 5 to 30 minutes per paper. So you could do the math. If that's all you told me I had to do, I had to do nothing else for the next week, I would say that's too much work. To have to go through 180 papers from middle schoolers writing about.
And it's a lot of fun, too.
It's a lot of fun. I'm sure the 56th paper is riveting. I'm being sarcastic. But so there's one, and once again, I never want to position it as the AI somehow taking work or insights away from teachers. Because I've also heard on the other side that a lot of teachers derive a lot of insights from going through that process. But if they can work hand in hand, if the AI can, one of the mechanisms that we're trying to build is teachers can assign, say, a writing assignment through the AI. The AI works on the assignment with the student, thesis, outlining, highlights parts. It doesn't do it for the student, but acts as an ethical writing coach, and also can give the student feedback. Hey, based on the rubric, I would estimate that you're probably at a B+ right now. If you do this, you could probably get it to an A. When the student's ready, and first of all, the student's getting much more support and feedback than they have ever historically got, what you need to learn. But then when you're ready to submit, you submit to the teacher. And now the teacher, first of all, they're not just getting the final output, which typically is what happens. They're getting the whole process. The AI can say, hey, we worked on this for 4.5 hours. John had a little bit of trouble with the thesis statement, but eventually got there. The whole transcript is right here. I can answer it. And by the way, half of your class is having trouble with thesis statements, so I can help there. It's consistent with John's in-class work, so I'm confident John actually did it. So that's how you can undermine that other form of cheating, even if it's non-AI cheating. And by the way, based on the rubric, on the different dimensions, I'd give John an 80% on this assessment. Now the teacher then they're in the seat where they could review that. They could say, well, why did you give it 80%? Why didn't you give a 5 out of 5? But you can imagine that taking what could be 20 hours of work of grading papers and turning that into 2 hours of work, and also getting more insights, more support, and supporting students better. So that's the type of thing. We have a school, Khan Lab School, that I don't run the day-to-day of it. I'm on the board. But I'm always asking questions about like teacher workload, and it is amazing the amount of prep time. The average teacher is spending 5 to 20 hours a week of prep time. Most people don't see that. And then they have to go 5, 6 hours, be on in front of 30 kids in a classroom. It's a very, very hard job. So yes, if we can take that 5 to 20 hours and turn it into more like 2 hours a week, which actually feels about appropriate, then it would be a massive benefit, not just for the teachers' productivity for their own time and for the students, but there's teacher attrition. We're talking to districts that are using this as a recruiting tool and a retention tool.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many problems to solve, teacher attrition and all these other problems. Vilas,
Well, 2 things. One, I'm very happy to hear Sal Khan say you've not been cheating on your assignments using an LLM. Good job. Good. Like, that makes me happy. And second is I want to pick this up and look at it through that more expansive lens. Like, something quite fundamental is happening that's really very positive. If we could ask people who own their job function and say, what do you hate doing? And what do you like doing? We have this opportunity to reinvent entire job classes. I go around the country and I talk to firefighters and nurses and doctors and teachers and folks in all kinds of like blue collar professions. And they all have the same answer. They're like, you know what? I'm so worried that AI is going to take my job. But if you could show me that I could offload half of what I do that I really hate doing, and I could spend more of my time doing the stuff that gives me joy and where I feel like I drive value, you look at it job by job and you're like, okay, well, I'm an optimist, like I get it. That's an optimistic story. You look at it at a macroeconomic level and you say we have for the first time in 3 centuries, the opportunity to redefine what a job is and what a human does in it across sectors, across the entire economy. And it's not an argument about productivity. I think actually Fei said something really great a few weeks ago that's been in the back of my mind, like productivity increases doesn't naturally mean global prosperity.
Right.
Productivity is not the answer. But if we begin to think about agency, about ownership of what you do and why you do it, satisfaction, the idea that you contribute and participate in a way that creates individual prosperity, community agency, like global, I think there's a thread there that we should always talk about as much as we need to talk about job displacement.
Yeah. So I'll tell you that after teaching for 50 years, grading is the thing we hate the most, right? And my colleagues in computer science, Chris Peach and Don, have actually built a grading system that does stylistic grading on introductory programming assignments. Not does the program run right? That's easy, right? You just run it, but really grade it and give feedback to the students. So I think there's really hope there. But the other thing we could use help with, when I do the exercise, I do the lesson plan, I think it out, I think about how to explain the ideas. It's creating the examples you want to use that takes an enormous amount of time. And if you could figure out a way to automate that, you could get great examples and without having to spend all the time that goes into it. So there's a real place where we could augment and, as you said, give the teacher agency, make them more powerful, and give them more time to spend on the things they want to do, right? That would be terrific. One of the questions we always get when we have education panels is, how do we think about the multidimensional space of learning? Certainly we want the kids to thrive and be able to demonstrate certain skills, but we also want them to develop a love of learning and to feel like they're going to be engaged in learning new things for the rest of their life, because the one thing that's for sure is they're going to have to be lifelong learners if they're going to thrive in the society we're in. Can we think about how our tools might actually accomplish that goal as well?
One of the things I'm excited about is, even if you go to top universities, you hear professors saying students have forgotten how to write, or they never learned how to write. And I don't know how much, there might be some studies on this, but I think common sense would be it's to some degree it's because people have stopped measuring it in the system over the last 20 or 30 years. And I'm not anti-standardized assessment. Anyone who pushes back, I'm like, are you against the standardized part or are you against the assessment part? Like ideally you have both, but there is a hidden problem with them in that when you design standardized assessments, they naturally have to be scalable, they need to be standardized, and they have to be reasonable cheap to develop. And so you lose things like, say, writing. We've never had great assessments for things like oral communication, for being able to deal with conflict, all of these what we call soft skills, because we've never had any hard ways of measuring them. And every time we panic about education, we anchor on what those narrow standardized tests measure more and more, and then the whole system just becomes narrow. I think, and you're going to see this fast, opportunities, and we are already working on these types of things where we're thinking about the future of assessment, where, yeah, it can be what we currently have, but now we can actually start to make sense of students' work and get insights from students' work. We could actually have students explain their reasoning. We could have them design something, but assess it in a reasonably standardized way. And I know there's a lot of worry, and there should be, about, hey, once you have AIs assessing what we consider subjective work, like an essay or a design, there's potential for bias, et cetera. And there is potential for bias, but there's way more potential for bias in a human system. You know, when you take an AP exam and you write those, you don't know who's grading what and how tired they are or whatever, and that's the system. And even that is super expensive, and you're usually not getting it. So I think as we bring in, we're going to be able to assess a much broader class of things, and we're also going to be able to do a much richer set of activities. You know, already in some of these things, we're just kind of throwing stuff on a wall to see if people find it interesting, but we're having teachers now use Conmigo, and we have these activities where you could talk to AI simulations of literary characters and historic characters, but we're seeing teachers in mainstream public schools, they're about to cover the Declaration of Independence. They say, all right, we have a special guest, Thomas Jefferson. Bring him up on the overhead projector, and kids ask AI simulation of Thomas Jefferson, hard questions, frivolous questions, questions that he won't weigh on because he doesn't have context on. It's a whole other thing about guardrails. But that starts to unlock a certain magic to a classroom that never existed before. You know, I always say, you know, a lot of people tell me things like, oh, that's going to work for the motivated kids. That's going to work for the curious kids. And I will say sometimes they use that intention with like under-resourced kids. Like, oh, that'll work for the and they imagine certain motivated kids, and then they say in contrast to under-resourced, I was like, are you saying under-resourced kids aren't motivated? Because I haven't met a 4-year-old. If you put something interesting in the room, they're gonna cry if you don't let them explore it. But something about a traditional school system, a lot of kids not all kids, not the kids who end up at Stanford, but a lot of the kids end up disengaged. And if we can keep that wonder, keep that magic, and you know, we've always talked about personalized education even before AI. Hey, if you're at an 80% level of understanding, it doesn't mean you're not bright. You should be able to keep working on it. But now AI can do that and hopefully bring back some of this wonder and magic.
Interesting. What do you think, Vilas? Do you think?
Yeah, look, I think that we are still using what are fundamentally 19th century pedagogical methods to train 21st century skills, curiosity, and creativity. And I think we have gotten so stuck in inertia, and I'm sitting here with Sal, right? Like the person to me who lives the embodiment of changing that dynamic. But across most of the schools that I visit across this country, like yes, they know what Khan Academy is, and they're still stuck in doing exactly the same thing they were doing last year and a decade ago and 50 years before that. Your wife's a teacher, my wife's a behavioral economist, right? We spend a lot of time thinking about structural transformation at scale. And she's probably the wisest person I know. She says, look, at the end of the day, like you have to help people realize that the choices they want to make are actually within their reach. That's it. There's not a teacher in this country that I think if you said to them, there's a much more effective way for you to do what makes you passionate about being a teacher, and all you have to do is kind of break out of the inertial mold you're in, that would turn it down, right? In the same way that 4-year-old's like wants to play with the toy, I think a teacher wants to educate kids. Yeah. They're stuck because they can't do it because the systems around them are so calcified. So to me, and it comes back to the theme I think you're hearing from me throughout this, right? AI is giving us that amazing use case that says, for a long time we've hypothesized that a better way is possible, now we've got it. But just because it exists, inertia doesn't equal inevitability, right? We've got to now go back and say, how do we change the structures of superintendents in school districts? How do we change the way that principals measure teachers? Yes, how do we assess our students, but how do we assess the effectiveness of our programs and actually give an alternative view of a reality that's possible, because AI empowered us to get to the conversation, but isn't going to empower us to get to the outcome by itself.
So when you think about particularly around K-12, I mean, the scale of this system is gigantic, and to get massive change seems hard. So you guys are on the nonprofit side. Can you, from philanthropic or from your work style, can you create the kind of groundswell change that we need, or is some other third hand going to have to come in and help achieve this?
It's a good question. We're definitely trying. And I tell our team, we have this internal goal of we need to really lead on AI in education. And, our team members rightfully sometimes will say, well, why us? Why don't we just stick to what we were doing before? And I say, well, one, what I said earlier is look, we've always been about free world-class education. The free for anyone anywhere is because we think these technologies can scale and the marginal cost is low. And the world-class is because we think things like personalization are now doable using technology, and AI allows us to get that much closer. But then they say, but why do we have to lead here? Why do we have to really have it? And I was like, well, AI allows you to do a much broader class of things than we used to be able to do. Even now, I just talked about what we're working on, writing education. If you asked me 5 years ago, I thought it was going to be 50 years before Khan Academy has a writing tutor. Mm-hmm. We've been able to, design and build that in roughly a year. And so I think people are increasingly going to be looking for non-fragmented solutions, and there's benefits for the user. You want the same AI that's your writing tutor. You also want it to be your math tutor. You also want it to be able to talk to your teachers and your parents. Help your teacher create the lesson plan based on the interactions that it's had with the individual students. That's going to create value. And then, the next pushback, well, then why us? And I said, this is where the non-for-profit really matters, because one, this technology is very exciting, but it can also be super creepy. So there is a world where the creepiness and the fear of the creepiness wins out. And it is true. Do I want the same organization that on one part of their business is selling me ads, on another part of their business has access to every interaction with their AI tutor that a student has over 12 years? I don't want that for my own for my own kids. And so I think there's just a trust. And it's not just a brand trust, it's that no, our org is literally set up. Our true north is not to somehow monetize your data. We do leverage data to personalize, to measure our efficacy, but we're not going to use it to do shady things. A lot of, I think there's a lot that happens in the for-profit realm, but a lot of the data privacy, they'll say things like, we won't monetize your data or share it with any third parties unless we go bankrupt or get acquired. And that's 95%. And I think there's, I've been looking at some of the, and so, people have to, especially with something as sensitive as conversations with an AI, I would say any kind of learning data, a huge amount of sensitivity, so that's another thing. And then the other aspect is what we've been talking about is assuming that we can create these great tools that can empower teachers, that can accelerate learners, who's going to be thinking about the equity side of that lens? Things like, these tools are getting faster, but there's always going to be a frontier that will probably always cost in that $20 to $30 a month range. That's what Copilot costs. That's what, that's where we can go in and we just had announced a partnership with Microsoft where they're giving us $7.5 million of compute so that we can give these teacher tools for free. These aren't teacher tools using non-frontier models. These are the things that the compute costs are significant, but we can give it out to teachers for free. And I think if we weren't in that ecosystem, no one would be pushing hard on that.
So clearly there's a role for philanthropy as well.
John, I have a staff member that every time I do a speaking engagement, she forces me to ask, is it on the record or off the record?
You don't have to promise.
No, wait. And eventually I was frustrated. I was like, why do you always make me ask? I'm going to say the same thing no matter what. It doesn't matter if it's on. And she said, yeah, I know, but it lets me manage my blood pressure. Let me answer your question very directly, right? Can civil society organizations, nonprofits, philanthropy create a groundswell? The answer is a flat out no. And that's not our role. Let's be super clear about it, right? What philanthropy and nonprofits are supposed to do are invest in those high-risk, exemplar projects, the kind of work that Sal does, to show that it's possible. But at the point where any of us expect nonprofits and philanthropy to somehow transform education or economic opportunity or dignity and justice in the legal system, we have forgotten the responsibility that we have put on institutions that are supposed to do that for us. Institutions that are noticeably absent in the AI discussion, right? If the policymakers that we're looking to in Washington are squabbling about a small set of how they regulate tech companies without asking fundamental questions about how we should be changing access to technology in the classroom, but how we should be funding massive amounts of public investment and research dollars, how we should be fundamentally transforming the structure of American education. And I realize that's a crazy thing to say, right? But never in the history of America have philanthropies and nonprofits systematically changed a massive sector like this.
So I agree with that.
Yeah.
So here's my question then.
And I have a
What
minor
role,
point of
what role does the foundation world and the nonprofit world have in helping convince the policymakers to make the change that we desperately need?
Yeah, so three things that we should be doing, right? One is we are, philanthropies in particular, the providers both of capital and hopefully technical expertise to support nonprofits in building exemplar models that show where the change should go. I think of civil society as the ones who hold the moral compass, who are able to say, this is the direction we should be heading, and we'll show you how to get there by establishing the possibility of it. But recognizing that what needs to happen then is a groundswell of public engagement that tells policymakers, we've got the roadmap, now it's time to invest in it and hold them accountable. Second, very briefly, is nonprofits are the ones who I think are often closest to communities and are most able to break the inertia of some of these structural systems we've talked about. And we need to look to them again for that moral leadership, but also that innovation function. And the third is I think foundations play the counterpoint to private sector technology development, right? If in the world today, like the vast majority of AI folks are going to private sector companies, philanthropies have the capital to actually create new technological capacity in the world, new institutions to support things like public compute access, to support jobs that pay maybe not market rates, but close to market rates, to allow people to have an alternative pathway to go out and build technology for good. So I believe we have a critical role to play. I just want to make sure that as nonprofits and philanthropies are doing this critical work, we're not relieving the people that are actually supposed to hold the moral responsibility for it from it, right? So let's get them at the table and make sure they're paying attention.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with nearly everything.
Sure.
And the only thing I think the place where we agree, and we were talking in the green room a little earlier, is the role of foundations and nonprofits are where if the for-profit sector can do a lot of great things, but there are places where markets oftentimes fail. Education and healthcare is one where the beneficiaries, the decision makers, and the payers are all different people. That's a good setup for market failure. And even when it kind of works, it doesn't always lead to outcomes that are consistent with our values. If someone wants to learn, they should be able to learn. They shouldn't have to get a credit card out. If someone's bleeding, cure them, and then think about how you're going to pay for it. And in theory, government could step in, but we know, especially in fast-moving or complex or places where there's other interests that are controlling government, they're not going to do anything. And so that's the role for the nonprofit sector, for foundations. The only thing I agree 100%, and I think there's different nonprofits that work on different part of the ecosystem, creating proof points, doing the research, working with communities. And I don't want to pretend that Khan Academy by itself is going to be able to. But I push myself and I push our team that, like, in a world where if we can't scale to 1 billion users and really become, hopefully we can raise the ceiling for 1 billion kids who have access to reasonable schools. Hopefully most of us like the type we grew in, and make it more personalized. But there's also an opportunity to become kind of a safety net school system for the world, where in these low resource places where you don't have access to a school, et cetera. And I tell our team, if we don't do it, it's not clear if anyone's going to do it. You could wait 100 years for governments to even think about that. So I do see there is also a role for scaling into places that, and maybe working in close partnership with industry. And we've been talking to some companies that have just discovered a lot of oil in a country that does not have a education system. And look, to these energy companies' credit, at least in the meetings that I'm in, they recognize that they can't be like all extractive, that it has to be like they have to do. And there's like, how can we work together to like build? And it's not just, Sal goes in there and says do this or do that, but do as a partnership. So it's, but I do think there's also value of kind of the NGO sector being able to do that type of work.
Yeah. Besides, Saul, do you want to be a leader or do you want to be a follower? In the end, that's an easy question to ask people. So let me ask you a question, Saul. You've got more users than anybody who's developing education technology. So you have a lot of data. And how do you think about sharing that data or giving other people access to it so that research organizations like Stanford or other places could advance the quality of education tools? Have you thought at all about this?
Yeah, and this goes well before AI. And one of the reasons why it really was, I've been able to backtrack and have an intellectual argument for why we're a nonprofit, part of which I shared, but it was really an emotional decision back in the day when I set it up as a nonprofit. It just felt right that we're going to create some type of an institution. But part of the intellectual rationale was, even before AI, hey, data could be really valuable, it could be used to personalize, it could be used to measure efficacy, et cetera, et cetera. It could be used to learn about how people learn, all sorts of interesting things, but it could also be used to sell the data, monetize, et cetera. So and I used to be a hedge fund analyst, a lot of folks know, and I saw what happens when you have different capital structure, when you start having different interests, and when push comes to shove and you're not meeting your earnings, you get very tempted to start monetizing data in a certain way. And so that was one of the reasons. And so we've always, I believe, been very true to our word of that we would only, and this is what our board pushes us on, they're not trying to get us to monetize, only use it for improving our own efficacy, measuring our impact, personalizing it more for learners. And there's also been a dream of, could we create a platform of sorts that other people could use it? Now, we have had partnerships, including probably with several people in this room over the years. I think there's just been a bandwidth issue of how do you create the APIs and create the tools, and also make districts feel comfortable that even if you're sharing it with a professor, right, there's all sorts of data privacy laws that get complicated. But that definitely would be the intent.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting role for nonprofits to take these kinds of data, whether it's about education or environmental data. You want to capture environmental data? It's in hundreds and hundreds of different data sets that are all incompatible. But if we put it together, we would have much better models of climate and what's happening on the environment. And philanthropy may have to be the thing that induces that kind of activity to occur.
I think it's happening at massive scale already in a really exciting way. You mentioned a couple of these use cases. At COP, we launched with Vice President Gore the largest aggregation of climate data using methane emissions. We built the largest repository with WRI of climate data in the world. In education, we think there's this massive opportunity. What I think happens, though, is the aggregation of data can't be the endpoint, of course, right? But philanthropic institutions aren't yet equipped to really understand how to bring the technical expectations of a data set like that to shape them in ways that are really relevant, which means that we need greater partnership, I think, with academia in particular and with private sector companies to say, look, we can put out some really great products, but what we need is a cultural shift in the idea that we need libraries of the future, right? We need to think about data aggregation not merely at like a global level of geospatial. We need community level data stewardship that's owned by the communities that can then be used to drive models at scale.
Okay, so let's talk about another education problem, namely the shadow of the pandemic, which has been disproportionately fallen on lower income, lower resourced families and kids. And probably, California is probably front and center and overdoing it in terms of pandemic response and shutting down for too long. And you look at the data now that shows there's an enduring gap. Is there a way to close that gap? Can we use some technology to help us close it? Because otherwise, I don't see how we're going to get our schools to close it just with their effort.
I think there are solutions. It goes back to what we were talking about before, whether we can get these solutions and used well in these very human systems that have a lot on their plate. But what we've been talking about things like personalization and mastery learning. Mastery learning is just a fancy way of saying, hey, if you have a gap in something, work on it. And this was an issue well before the pandemic. I point out that in our current non-mastery system, kind of seat time-based system, students in the US go through classes called algebra and geometry and trigonometry, and we could do the same thing on the humanities side, but the roughly half of kids who even decide to go to college, when they go to college, this doesn't happen at Stanford, but it happens in the California community college system, a majority of them, when they take a placement test, they get placed into essentially 7th grade math. Because the system, even though they spent 4 or 5 years in arguably more advanced classes, this is not an exception, that's the norm. That was the norm before the pandemic. Before the pandemic, the average American math classroom had 3 grade levels of students in that same classroom, even though they were the same age. And now it's 6 grade levels in a mainstream class. So there's some kids who might be right at grade level, maybe a little ahead, and there's some kids who are literally 4 or 5 grade levels behind. I point out, after the pandemic, Detroit Public Schools, the number of kids, I think there was 8th graders who are at proficiency is 3%. But before the pandemic it was 6%. So it's bad, and it was bad before. So I don't want to pretend like we're just going to be able to wave a magic wand and have it all solved in 10 years. I think unfortunately, if I'm realistic, there will be some real enduring damage, not just from the pandemic, but from what was happening even before the pandemic. But I think there is hope We've been working very closely with Newark, New Jersey, and it's a mainstream public school system that has all the benefits and inertias and frictions that you would expect anywhere. But over the last year and a half, 2 years, we've been able to get 70% of their kids in the North Ward, that's about a third of the district, and now we're going district-wide, at the level of dosage that's associated with pretty strong efficacy results. We're just starting to analyze their actual data. You heard it here. You're going to see, I think, the first large-scale movement, not just an efficacy study, like actual, that whole section of the district accelerating forward in ways that you haven't seen in large urban school districts. So I think there's hope. I hope we can spread that type of what we're doing in Newark to as many school districts as possible. But realistically, I think there will be some permanent damage.
Yeah, and this is really an equity issue because even though the gap was always there, it's gotten bigger. And in California, you can really see that. And I think somehow we have to try to close it because otherwise we're going to leave a generation of kids at a disadvantage.
I think that's right. I'll widen the aperture a bit. When we talk about the long tail of the pandemic, we often take a pretty domestic focus, right? But you take that and you look at it internationally in many of the places we work around the world, and the fundamental constructs of that long tail look very different, right? They're no longer about, oh, you've missed a couple of years in a very structured progression. It's you're often on an off-ramp from an educational pathway. That what we in the US talk about as a digital divide that was about limited access, in many parts of the world is for 18 months, things were shut down cold.
Yeah.
Right? And so now you've got a set of folks, and we're seeing it now in Botswana and Zambia and Zimbabwe and places that we work around the world, where the story of the long tail of the pandemic isn't how do we get people back on track, it's how do we get people to believe again that the track matters? Because they've gone off to do other things. Kids are working, right? They're into pathways where they have some form of employment, not particularly good employment. So this idea of equity, taking it back to the storyline of, we see segmentation here in the United States. Sal's spoken to some of the ways that we know we can address it. How do we take that analysis and apply it to a frame of communities that are so far away from the structure that we hold kind of as inevitable and say, what do we actually do about this? And I don't have an answer for you, right? This is several 100 million children around the world operating in environments where it's kind of like the blip from the Marvel movies, right? And somehow you're back. And they're expected not to go into the grade level, as Sal was saying, that they're naturally supposed to be in, but they're now 3 years older. They should be in a class 3 years later. And they just lose it, right? They're totally off the path.
They're completely off the path, yeah.
And for that, again, we come back to this, well, what's the remediation? I don't know that there's much other than my sources of hope that I keep coming back to, right? One is things like we've talked about, technological innovation that step outside of the system and create new pathways, right? We've got some folks here in the audience, Manu from Karya, right? That are thinking about how we empower communities to participate in economic systems in ways that 5 years ago just didn't exist. Can we use those to reinforce the idea that kids, that young adults need to get back into educational pathways because at least they have a real idea of what they could do if they had those skills that would get them, economic opportunity? How do we build like those righteous kind of virtuous feedback cycles and do it at scale?
Yeah, it's a good question. So this morning I tried an experiment. I asked 2 different LLMs to prove the Pythagorean property using the trapezoid area technique, which, by the way, was invented by James Garfield, the 15th president of the United States. He's the one that discovered this insight. They both got it wrong. They got the basic outline of the proof right. They lined up the triangles properly, and they drew the line that made the trapezoid. But they both did the math wrong. So is hallucination going to be a big issue in our education systems? Because I can work it out, but if I give this to a kid, they're going to say, this doesn't work. But what are we going to do about this part of the problem?
Yeah, it's a real issue, but I remind folks it's not in some ways a new issue. For the last 20 years, people would go do web searches, and who knows what types of sources they might fall on. Usually in math, they tend to be reasonably reliable sources, but in other subjects in humanities, you can get very not intentionally unreliable sources there. And so the way that we've tried to address it to limited, to varying degrees is digital literacy. I think the same thing, that's the first line of attack. These tools are powerful. They can help you in many ways, but they have some limitations. So you need to put that in place, but on top of that, the tools have dramatically improved. But they still have a lot of issues. They're still not, I would say the math accuracy, something more sophisticated like the proof of Garfield's, which is, by the way, is amazing. There's only,
it is an amazing proof. It's
only
very
like
clever. Garfield's proof is very clever.
I think there's only 7 or 8 novel proofs of the Pythagorean theorem in like the last 2,500 years. One of them was Garfield when he's sitting in the U.S. Congress board. Yeah. Like he literally just comes up with, there's a Khan Academy video about it.
He was a university president before that, so.
Okay, yes, he had some, but it's impressive. We by our measures, and this is part of this new world of developing applications in an AI world, we're creating our own evaluation framework so we can see what the error rate is. Obviously, we're doing a bunch of layers on top of the models to improve that, to do multiple checks. But it's the hallucination rate has gotten, I would say it's definitely a factor of 10 less than it was a year ago. And I would say the math error rate is at least a factor of 5 less before you even start putting on these other layers. Now, it can still make errors, and we warn people that, and how do you handle that, and how can you tell it's happening, and we give teachers oversight to provide some of those protections. But everyone that we're talking to, and we're in a somewhat fortunate position that I think a lot of the people developing the leading edge AIs are trying to work with us because they're like, hey, this is a good use case, it's good PR, et cetera, et cetera. I think most of them think that this will be a solved problem within a year. So things are moving fast.
That's great. Anything to add, Vilas?
It's my favorite thing about coming to Stanford that I'm a computer scientist with multiple advanced degrees. And you show up here and you sit on stage with 2 people that both clearly know how to do the trapezoidal proof of the Pythagorean theorem. And I'm sitting here and like, man, I got nothing to say here.
All right,
but let me say one thing, right? Which is like, it's actually a perfect example of like this core piece of what do we trust AI systems to do? Yeah. I agree with you. The hallucination program will be like, why are we trusting that these AI systems tell us the truth? Like that whole conversation that you all have a preview into, I'm happy to have afterwards. Like that's the perfect example. Yeah. Like don't trust the AI system to give you the right answer. Trust it to help you ask the right questions and make sure that you're critiquing.
Yeah. It actually make a good assignment. Tell me what's wrong with this proof. I can give it.
Yeah, exactly.
So, okay, my last question. My favorite last question. You get one silver bullet to change something in the education system. It could be technology, it could be teacher training, it could be school structure, length of the school year, governance. To get the biggest effect, what would you change?
I would create at least nationally or maybe globally recognized competency-based system of credentials that are recognized and valued by employers. So you know how to do X, there's some rich assessment to take X, it's very accessible, and there's many people can compete on how you prepare for that assessment. You could use Khan Academy, you can use a MOOC, you can go to your local community college, you can take a course at Stanford. But if you know that, whether it took you 6 days or 6 years to learn it, there's all these employers who immediately say, yes, I want you, you are now equivalent, we're gonna put you in the same batch as Stanford grads with 3.5 GPA, you are now part of the job pipeline. I think you do that. In this world of post-pandemic, kids are falling off, but a lot of kids, once they're in their 20s or 30s, they have a family, they're like, oh, I want to get serious. Yeah. It gives them an opportunity to go back. GEDs have a stigma.
Completers, this whole big problem we have.
Exactly. And as we have job dislocation with AI, you're going to have that even for the people who go to Stanford. You're going to need ways to switch into other careers, and it shouldn't be viewed as something with a stigma or something that's less than. The top employers will hopefully recognize there might be different layers. Google and a McKinsey might want a level 10. Someone else might want a level 8, but it's there and it's transparent for everyone.
Yeah. Vilas, what do you think?
Fully agree with this. I think getting employers into reshaping the educational system would be so helpful. But my answer is a slightly different lens. And I go back to this example of talking to my nephew. This idea of like consumer or like user-based design, like my silver bullet is like over the next 5 years, I think this is going to happen no matter what. Let's actually create a mechanism by which students who are going through this transformation at the front line are actually able to inform the design of the educational system they're in. Right? If over the next 5 years we see students using Khan Academy, using online AI systems in such productive ways, I think we need a mechanism to take that lived experience and learning that they have and use it to redesign the system that operates against them. And we've got to figure out how to do that. I don't know if it's a silver bullet or if it's an investment from the people in this room, but that will actually help us get to a better future.
Well, that was great. Please join me in thanking our 2 panelists for a really great session.
Thanks so much. This was amazing.
Yeah, it was fun.
That was great.
Thank you, John.